Okay, moving on to the next chapter, we're talking about targeting weaknesses and positions. So general weaknesses come like the minute weaknesses. So after considering tactics, when there's not many tactics available, you feel like the game is relatively equal in position. So let's start with like drawing a map. So we have the opening, we have the middle game, and then we have the middle game where it's an equal position. Imbalances are only reflected in weak pawn structure. Okay, so in the case of doubled pawns or isolated pawns, you want to exchange pieces. That's the idea. So opening, middle game, equal position. This is when you can't find tactic. Equal position, equal threat. Equal threats. The threats are minimal. Middle game, imbalances are only reflected in weak pawn structure. You want to exchange all minor pieces. And again, I have to emphasize this again, if no only if no tactics to gain advantage in material, tempo, development, or material tempo only. This is why it's really important to consider CCT first. So we want to consider checks, captures, and threats first. We want to exchange all the minor pieces, such as the bishop and knight. Exchange all minor pieces. And then if even after that we don't have a favorable position, then we exchange the rooks. Or sorry, we exchange the queens. Or sorry, when we get there, we'll reach a queen and rook versus queen and rook endgame. And then even after that, if we can't figure that out, we exchange queens to end in a rook and queen. Okay, so this is the elaborate flow of how chess would work, I guess. This entire in this game, overall chess flow. I think this is really important later to consider down the line. I think this is how the chess game should work overall from, I guess, a perfect standpoint. Exchange all minor pieces. This is just another way of saying simplification. Yeah, and then sorry, in a rook with or without pawn endgame, or rook endgame, rook and pawn endgame. Because if it's a rook versus rook endgame, it's a draw. Okay, so after considering this chess flow opening, we'll consider specific weaknesses. These include isolated pawns, where the side, so an isolated pawn is just a pawn that's by itself. So imagine, say for example, in this case, there is only this pawn here. This is an isolated pawn because it can't be defended by these pawns here. Okay, these pawns can't defend this pawn. There should be a pawn here or a pawn here. Because there's none, it's called an isolated pawn. That's considered a weakness. So the idea is to either stack up all your pieces here, from claiming active minor pieces using the this is to prevent the isolated pawn from claiming other active minor pieces on the opponent's side as compensation using the isolated pawn, and this also contributes to the development if the isolated pawn were to participate in exchange. That's why you want to get rid of the minor pieces in such a situation. And then for the side with the isolated pawn, the side with the isolated pawn is considered material or immediate advantage, so try to avoid exchanges unless it's necessary. The idea is to create a further dynamic advantage that can convert into a static advantage in the long run, if not win the game. So we'll get into statics and dynamics eventually, but for now it's considered an advantage if you have the isolated pawn. But out of context, that sounds very wrong because it is a weakness, but it's also a material advantage if the isolated pawn is remaining. So honestly, this bit isn't really that important. I would take this with a grain of salt. And then the backwards pawn for the side against the side with the backwards pawn, you want to trade all the minor pieces. Again, to prevent the side with the backwards pawn similar to the isolated pawn from claiming active minor pieces as compensation using the isolated pawn or using the backwards pawn. So I copy pasted some of this. Okay. And then double pawns. Double pawns are... So the idea of a double pawn is to pile as much pressure onto this weakness as possible. When you have an isolated pawn in this position here, there were a lot of ways to handle taking on this isolated pawn, but essentially it ended up with all of black's pieces putting pressure on this pawn right here, the one that's circled in green. Okay, and naturally you'll target the square in front typically as you have more support from your pieces which are at the back. Okay, and then weak squares, again, using your knights, and then a centralized uncastled king, you want to take advantage of that by putting pressure on the position when possible. Okay.